got a license to talk.
Shocking. Positively shocking.
And the words are for your ears only.
I think you got the point.
Welcome to The Words Are Not Enough.
In part 2 of our 2-part episode 20 special, the Twain crew goes through the years discussing which Bond films are the best reflection of the decade they were released in. And we take into account the results of our Twitter poll, which you, the audience, participated in. All of this coming your way now. All right, so I believe that does it for Q Branch, and believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a discussion segment to get to, but this show has gone on very long. We talked about a lot, but
the show is not enough, Griffin.
Hey, listen, we're not going to jip you on content, because when we put out an episode, it's usually pretty beefy. So let's move into our...
It's usually like once... our release schedule is only slightly less consistent than Eon's.
Yeah, right. There you go. But anyways, moving on to our discussion segment, Shaken But Heard. Brody, do you want to introduce this one, since it was actually a topic that you came up with, and I believe you integrated onto the Twitter account?
Yeah, sure. So basically, we've mentioned this a couple times earlier in the show, but...
Yeah.
On the Twain account, on the Twain Pod Twitter account, we post a lot of just sort of discussions, polls, what have you, because we like engaging with you guys, our audience. And one that we did, I want to say 2 weeks ago, it was a little bit ago, but not too long ago, was basically, which Bond film do you feel best encapsulates the aesthetic of the decade it came out in? So basically, which film do you think all-round best represents or is indicative of the time that it came out, the moment in time that it came out. And we got some really interesting responses and really interesting debate. And so we thought we might talk a bit about that ourselves, share our thoughts, our rationales for our picks, and then maybe go through some of your answers and just discuss them a little bit. Because while I put my own answers in the post itself, people were making arguments where I'm like, I really can't rebut that. That is a valid point. I mean,
right.
if my answer wasn't a different one, I would probably have put the one you put, because, I think there's a lot of wiggle room for this. There's no definitive answer.
Well, and that's the thing.
It comes down to how you define a decade.
I was just about to say,
mind.
Yeah. That's really the thing. Is like, when you think of a certain decade, what really pops in your mind? And I feel like there's a Bond film for every part of the decade that really, comes to the forefront for you. So it's interesting, especially reading some of the responses. But shall we begin?
Absolutely, go for it.
All right, so starting with... Right, yeah, you've already played... Well, just in case they haven't seen the post, we'll have you do yours. But I'll go first with the 60s. So for the 60s, to me, I think, when I think of the 60s, I know there's different interpretations of it, but I usually, something like Mad Men, something that's really clean, kind of a extension of the 50s, but definitely not the 50s at all. But the clean-cut style, just kind of very, it's really hard to describe without saying the Mad Men aesthetic, but that's legitimately.
But no, I know what you're like the very like minimalistic.
Yes, minimal. That's perfect.
Minimalism, sleek, like lines and like pastel colors almost. Yeah.
Yep. But at the same time, you definitely still
Monist,
have the right, and you definitely still have the effects of the Cold War going on. One of like the two really peaks of it, really. And so to me, the film that best encapsulates that is From Russia with Love, because you not only get that traditional, 60s aesthetic from a style point of view, but then that film very directly deals with the Cold War as it was seen at that point in time. And so I think for a decade that was really kind of defined by those two points, to me, that one really just screams 60s. So that's kind of what I go to when I think of that. I mean, realistically, the first four Connery films, you could pick any of them, but I just pick From Russia with Love because of its direct tie into the Cold War.
Yeah, no, I can totally see where you're coming from, and this one is like where I can see probably most definitively just depends on how you define that decade, especially for us because we didn't live through it. Yeah, for me personally, I went with On Her Majesty's Secret Service because to me, that like On Her Majesty's Secret Service best like encapsulates that swinging 60s kind of like psychedelic, free love, that kind of thing. You have Lazenby, who's quite youthful. He sort of almost feels like a bond of the youth culture at the time, the counterculture bond, in a lot of ways. And that may just be because of how much of Lazenby puts into his bond. And as we all know, that was definitely on Lazenby's mind at the time. That's why he left the role. And I think it definitely comes across in that film. Just everything he wears, those boots, fucking the boots that Austin Powers ends up wearing.
Yeah, Austin Powers takes a lot from. See, but that's the thing, though. I feel like Majesties. Yeah, I feel like Majesties. Yeah, you're right. It does incorporate the swinging 60s a little bit, but there's
even like you've got the women with their hairdos and their their dresses. Everything about it just feels like so definitively 60s. Like if it had come, I watched a little feature. I forget what it was called, but it was starring Mark Gatiss and this other guy. And they were just talking about Bond. It was this little like special feature thing on the BBC, and he sort of perfectly said what I was thinking, which was that like if this film had come out a year later, because this comes out in 1969, if this thing had come out 1970, it's a completely different movie, and just aesthetically it is. And I think that's so true. I think this movie is so perfectly the 60s. It kind of just, for me, even like just the visuals of it, like something about the way in the opening credits, the way the women are posed, like when they're doing the coat of arms, just looks so 60s to me. You have all the lights and the, oh my God, it's just everything about it. To me, that's what I think of when I think of the 60s. But you do have a good point. There is like that early 60s, late 50s kind of thing that is still very much part of the 60s aesthetic as well. The more stylish, clean-cut version of the 60s, like the Kennedy era of the 60s. That's
kind of where I kind of like lean into.
For me, I think for me, if I was going to pick one from that era, it would probably be like either Dr. No or Goldfinger.
Interesting. So interesting.
Not that Ferocious Love is definitely 60s. I think for the Cold War stuff, it almost feels 50s to me. And whereas like in Dr. No, you have like this isn't so much aesthetic it is like the plot elements of the story. But Dr. No, he's toppling missiles, which felt very current with the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. And then in Goldfinger, really the plot has not much to do with the geopolitics of the time, other than the Chinese are helping Goldfinger, but that film is just so stylish. Like it is just so like, wow, look at this. And you have that Ken Adams set with the of Fort Knox, and it just looks like this is the 60s in Technicolor. Like
yeah.
And maybe because it goes to America too, and I think of America a lot when I think of the 60s.
When you think of the 60s, same. Yeah. No, that's an interesting point. I think all valid point. Like I said, you could pick any of Connery's like first 4 films, really. I mean, even You Only Live Twice a little bit, but especially those first 4, they really do scream 60s. And you make a good point for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. To me, I mean, you're right. I do get a little bit more 70s vibes, like early 70s vibes from it, but I mean, I can't really argue. You make a good point. So moving on to the 70s. Speaking of that, woohoo! Exactly. So do you want to go first? Or you want me to go first? Or what? I'll just go first.
Let's keep the rhythm going. Yeah. You go first.
All right. So for me, the one that 100% with like over every other film here that screams the 70s is Live and Let Die. That movie is almost a just like caricature of the 70s in some respect, but from Roger Moore's freaking pants to the Paul McCartney and the Wings theme song, diving into the rock elements of the 70s. To like the blaxploitation going on there, which is a very 70s thing. The score is great, but also definitely has some of that 70s vibe to it. I mean, I don't really know what else to say other than you just watch that film and you're like, wow, yeah, this is a product of the 70s. This is we have moved into it's less like traditional minimalistic straight, and it's moved into something else entirely, very kind of psychedelic with like the the voodoo stuff going on there, Baron Samedi and whatnot. And I mean, I don't know, when Bond goes to New York City, and they're driving around and just the slang they're using, the lingo, the pimpmobile. I mean, my God, there's nothing else in Roger Moore's era that feels more 70s than Live and Let Die. You could make an argument for Moonraker. I'll say that. You can make an argument for Moonraker, especially being, late 70s, but yeah, dude, I think Live and Let Die is just, that is the 70s.
Get me a make on a white pimpmobile.
Exactly, right?
Great line from Felix. But
oh my God.
Yeah, no, you are right. And someone mentioned this in the comments when they answered, and I was sort of like, yeah, that's a great point. Everything in Harlem, I think that for me, that's where the film sort of peaks 70s, and then it becomes a little less 70s for me as the film goes elsewhere. It's just when it's in Harlem, it is so 70s. Like, yeah, everything about it is. And then, yeah, you're right. Even the score has like, and it's because it's by George Martin, who is like producer for the Beatles, and so he has he's very much in tune with that, like the sound of the times, and yeah, even like there's some little like I don't even know what you'd call it, like that like, yeah, it's like a blaxploitation sort of the guitar sound where it
yeah.
I don't know how you describe it. I'm not very good at describing that kind of music.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about, though.
Yeah. It's but it's just, it's of that time. Maybe a little bit to its own detriment. It's very dated, but
that's what I'm saying. Like, it's like there is nothing, like,
just like the attitudes.
Oh my God, yeah, it is just like so. It is a product. You watch that today, and it's like watching. It's just literally like watching an exaggeration of the 70s. It is a time capsule for sure.
For sure, I think for me, when I think of the 70s, I feel someone pointed this out to me. In the comments that like most of my picks were like from late in the decade, and I think just for me, when I think of a decade, I think of that end. Like I think that decade really finds its identity at the tail end of the decade, and as subconsciously, I guess I just sort of applied that to these Bond films. So for me, I picked The Spy Who Loved Me, which everything about that film, I don't think it could come out in a different time. It very much like you said with Live and Let Die, it's a time capsule. I think the first and foremost reason for that is Marvin Hamlisch's score, which is very disco infused, very kind of just of that moment in terms of popular music.
Yeah, that's true.
I think Live and Let Die's title song is a little more 70s just because it has like Paul McCartney and Wings.
Well, it plays into the 70s rock. Yeah.
Yeah, whereas what do you call it? Nobody Does It Better.
Nobody Does It Better.
Nobody Does It Better is more of a... I mean, it's definitely a 70s ballad, but you could definitely probably swing that in a different decade if you really tried. Like songs like that were released in the 80s as well. But so yeah, maybe not so much in that, but like the soundtrack itself, the score is so 70s. Everything about the sense of humor of it feels very 70s, like very sort of just, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to describe, like not like slapstick or anything, just very much more tongue in cheek. Reminded me of like English comedy, British comedy from the time.
Yeah.
Not quite Monty Python-esque, but it was like definitely like that sort of like that wry. It's very Roger Moore, very wry sense of humor. The clothing, like fucking Roger Moore's gigantic lapels, and yeah, just like everything.
I just can't. It's just the pants, man. His fucking
pants. Yeah, like the flares at the bottom of his pants.
They kill me. Oh my
dude,
God.
it's too much. I mean, and I think I was saying this to you before. I think you could extend that to Moonraker. I think Moonraker has a very Moonraker and Spy Who Loved Me feel very much of the same like identity, the same DNA, mostly because like the same people made it. Yeah. But I think the score gives Spy Who Loved Me the edge, where it's just Moonraker has a very traditional John Barry score, but Marvin Hamlisch's score is just so 70s. And you can make an argument that like there's a bit of disco in For Your Eyes Only score, even though it came out in, I think it's 81.
Yeah.
Which is like the very cusp of the new decade, so you couldn't really say it's totally 80s. But yeah, for me, I don't know. I will concede that Live and Let Die is a very, very good pick, but I'm going to stick with That's Why You Love Me. I think that just like when I watch that movie, when I want to watch a 70s Bond movie, that is the archetypical 70s Bond movie.
Really? Because I feel the same way about Live and Let Die.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's fair though. I mean, I can't argue.
yeah. I mean, it's. Anyways, moving on, I guess, to the 80s.
The 80s.
Very interesting because I feel like
hot decade.
every one of these films is like distinctly 80s. It's just a matter of which one screams more 80s.
The 80s.
To you.
Like, this is the thing. I think in terms of films that are not that are what's interesting about the 80s films and the 2000s films, maybe not the 2000s films, but like the 2010 films, is that I think a lot of the Bond films are like they owe a lot of their aesthetic to the 60s, just because that is when the films started and it sort of set the bar in terms of what they're supposed to look and sound like and feel like. And so a lot of the time you'll have every now and then a couple of films sprinkled in where it feels derivative of that style. But I think, the 80s is 100% not trying to be the 60s in any of the films. Every single one of those films is very content with, this is of the moment 80s film. And yeah, but so you can make an argument for like basically all of them. But
I mean, A View to a Kill, literally the opening title sequence you could literally say that one for that title sequence alone. But you brought up a good point yesterday, and I actually had the same opinion on it. It's because Roger Moore is so old, and because it's still kind of drawing from like the 70s style of film, late 70s style of filmmaking. I feel like it hadn't reached that modern 80s aesthetic. The opening sure as shit did, but like the film as a whole still feels like more is the 70s basically.
That's
and
the thing.
Film still has that.
That was the problem with Roger Moore's. As much as I love, like For Your Eyes Only is my favorite Roger Moore film, I think. But as much as I love, and I love Roger Moore, and then as much as I love For Your Eyes Only, which came out in the early 80s, Roger Moore very much belonged in the 70s. And
I agree.
The further into the 80s he stayed, the more and more, as much as I like those films, it became very apparent, like Octopussy, View to a Kill.
Very outdated,
it's not even outdated, it just feels like out of touch with the moment, like, that it exists in. Where it's just sort of like, this film with a younger actor in it would have been more 80s. This would have felt more modern. But he is kind of, as a performer, as his, not even as a performer, but as his performance of Bond is concerned, is so 70s that it felt like it had overstayed its welcome at that point, where it's just sort of like, Roger, I love you, but regardless of his age, it's just sort of like this performance belongs in the 70s, not the 80s.
But anyways, that is not my pick. So very clearly the two options are the two Dalton films, and it's a toss up. I still really can't. I still don't have a definitive pick, because the more I was thinking about it, I was like, originally I was like License to Kill, because it is just a straight up 80s action film. The music feels very 80s. The filming styles and whatnot feel very 80s. It is just a straight up 80s revenge action film. But then you look at The Living Daylights, and that's very in touch with the global politics of the moment. And the music as well is very in touch with the style of the 80s, incorporating the Pretenders into it, bringing in Aha to do there's a synth feel to it, but it doesn't overdo it with the synth. It just it uses it enough to feel, 80s. But I just think, I think of Necros' theme, and I'm just like, this is so 80s.
Necros' entire look is 80s.
His entire look is so, but it's very 80s.
Very much like Ivan Drago, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and it was interesting. I was trying to put my finger on it. The difference between the two, and there are a lot of differences. The Living Daylights is very much a spy espionage film, whereas License to Kill is very much it's just a revenge film.
It concerns itself with like cartel intrigue, like the war on drugs.
Right. But the thing about the Living Daylights is that is the 80s from the European perspective, whereas License to Kill is the 80s
very
from
American,
the
yeah.
American perspective. So it's I almost can't choose between them because they're both valid. Right now, I'm leaning more into the Living Daylights, but man, I don't know, because the entire third act of License to Kill is like
for me
straight up.
Yeah, I'm going License to Kill. I do definitely see what you're saying with Living Daylights, and that's a really good point. I would also say A View to a Kill is a very, very, very close. If not for Roger Moore, everything else in that film is so 80s, including like just Grace Jones and her look. Christopher Walken and his look, and just the whole style. I mean, Stacey Sutton, like Stacey Sutton as a character, literally stepped out of like Dallas, like the TV show.
She did,
yeah, and everything about her, like my daddy was an all Baron, and like all this kind of ridiculous stuff.
Oh my god!
And so, yeah, very 80s, but yeah, Roger Moore kind of pulls it back a little bit, makes it a little more less so. And then for like Living Daylights, I've always yeah, you're right. It is very much rooted in the time, and the aesthetic of it is very much 80s, like Cold War 80s thriller. But I think like there's almost like a timeless quality to some of it.
There is a bit of a timeless quality. That is what I will say. But
whereas I think License to Kill is 100%. I mean, and maybe this might come down to the way I view the 80s. The 80s for me, I didn't live through the 80s, so my perception of it is through media, and all the 80s media I consume, except for like bits and pieces here and there, and in terms of pop culture anyway, is American. And that just defines.
Shit, you're right. No, you're right. I have to give it to you, because you're right. The 80s is so defined by American,
and it is such an
pop
American
culture,
and it is such an American decade in general. The end of the Cold War, that kind of thing. And
I mean, you could. I was saying more leaning with Living Daylights, leaning more into the European side. I mean that kind of like
I agree with that
Cold
point.
War Berlin kind of stuff. You know, that it definitely does draw from that a little bit. Especially Necros, who literally looks like he stepped out of a Berlin nightclub in the 1980s. It's just wow. But you're right. I may have been thinking too much into the political landscape of the time with the end of the Cold War and stuff like that.
Rather than the aesthetic of it.
Rather than the aesthetic, because I think you're spot on, because License to Kill is rooted in America, and America is very much so. The 80s is kind of defined by American pop culture and the political, landscape of the Reagan years and stuff like that. So
war and drugs. Yeah, I think
the war on drugs. Yeah,
I mean, this film had it was so 80s. It had a subplot that kind of about Stinger missiles shooting down an airline, which was literally what was happening at the time. Yeah, it is just. I mean, but we're not counting plot lines too much. More so to do with the aesthetic. And yeah, I mean, the 70s is very garish, I think. I think it's a very ugly decade.
Oh, I agree. It's gross.
Style.
It's disgusting.
Really just ugly. And the 80s is just as garish, but in a more kind of a fun way, like the neon, all that, the pastel colors. This License to Kill looks like an episode of Miami Vice. And
God,
dude, and then I think add to that, because you're right. The music in The Living Daylights is it has a synth element to it, and John Barry is one of his best scores. I love it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Michael Kamen's score in License to Kill is so 80s, so 80s. I mean, you got a little bit of Die Hard in there. You got a little bit of what do you call it? Lethal Weapon. Just like those dudes' guitars, the guitar version of the fucking James Bond theme.
Michael Kamen did score Die Hard, so
and Lethal Weapon. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so he definitely is drawing from that. Yeah, yeah.
Because he pretty much defined the action movie sound of that decade, or at least the latter half of that decade. And I mean, there's a reason they brought him on. But even John. What surprises me most about that movie is that John Glenn's direction even changes. Because I mean, I think he's so versatile. I don't think we give him enough credit. The fact that he managed to go from making The Living Daylights, which is very traditional Bond film kind of style, to changing everything from his editing to his shot composition to make it feel like it could stand alongside something like Scarface, or stand alongside something like just like any of the drug fueled 80s mayhem that was going on at the time. Like, it is kind of unreal that he managed to do that. And yeah, I mean, the whole movie just screams 80s to me. Timothy Dalton's hair even looks like his little fucking when he pulls his hair back in the casino. It's a definitive look for Dalton, and it is so 80s. Yeah, no, I mean Pam when she gets her short hair and she wears like the dress and it's just the DEA is in the fucking movie.
The
like,
DEA, you sway, dude. Like I said, you sway. I was on the cusp. I was leaning more towards the Living Daylights, but you
the most 80s human being to ever exist is Kilifer, the CIA guy the DEA guy who like betrays everyone.
Oh yeah,
he's like he's like $500 million. Like what did he say? Not a billion. No, he was like when he like throws the money at him, he's like we can split it. Like it's
absurd. Yeah,
it's so 80s. Everything about it is so 80s. I love it.
I agree.
I can definitely see why it turns some people off because it is so 80s and it does feel a little divorced from the Bond aesthetic in some ways.
Yeah,
but
it really does.
It's a breath of fresh air. I love it. I think
I would agree with you. It's there you go. You swayed me.
Yes.
So
it's the second time this episode I've swayed.
No, actually it's not the second. Oh no, yes you did the Richard Madden. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, that was more of just like the conversation kind of went in a direction, and I'm not giving you credit for that first one. You will sway. You have swayed me for License to Kill, but not for that one. But anyways, moving on to the 90s. Now the 90s is interesting.
We're in total agreement on this one,
right? Yeah, I think we are very much in agreement on this one. There are, in my mind, there's really only two options because the world is not enough. It's a 90s film, but it almost kind of feels like it could be an early 2000s film, mainly because it did come out in 99. But I think
if not for that Millennium Bug joke.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, it's that kind of right. The only real options here I see are Goldeneye and Tomorrow Never Dies, and Goldeneye has too much of the 80s in it. To me,
into the Cold War, like just
it really just kind of like it's very much 90s in like the score and the kind of like the hair and like it is perfectly mid 90s. But
and like even all that tech stuff going on and
the tech stuff going on, the
giant
computers
and
Boris, like that character could not have been written in any other decade but the 90s.
All the UIs on the computers look like they're not like really bad versions of like Linux or something.
Right. But to me,
here we go.
Tomorrow Never Dies is
it's
perfectly
a
90s action movie. Tomorrow Never Dies is literally a John Woo 90s action movie. I mean, it is.
Dude. Yeah, well, that's the thing is, like, I would say, you said John Woo, there's so much John Woo in there with the slow motion. The dual wielding the guns, like, that's for that finale.
That's what I think of. Like, the finale is really just,
peak 80s. Yeah, I think, for me, I'm saying the same thing. I think I would say it's almost like James Cameron-esque. In the way it's
you're right.
And it would come down to Robert Elswith's like beautiful cinematography.
The cinematography,
It is something about the way it uses those like those crushed blacks with the floodlights and the just like its use of color, like those blues looks very James Cameron to me, like very Terminator.
I think it's. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it is.
But John Woo,
I
think it's like a marriage between John Woo and James Cameron.
Yeah, that was literally what I was about to say. I was like
two of the biggest filmmakers of the decade. So.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they really helped define the '90s action genre. And I mean, the plot is one of those things that's like the plot is so silly and simple that it could only be in like a '90s action movie. You know what I'm saying? Like the villains are so like. Terrifically hammy.
Yeah, and I think even if you take it away from take it away from aesthetic for a second and go talk about the plot, like that cable news stuff is very 90s.
Oh my god, yeah.
I mean, it's very relevant now too, but like that was like the advent of cable news, and so it just feels very appropriate. Like everything. Like speaking of like nightclubs, German nightclubs, that's where Mr. Stamper came from. Mr. Stamper literally came from a rave in like not even East Berlin, just like regular Berlin at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and then like even Bond's car in that movie, the BMW, one of his most ugly cars.
It is
literally
so 90s,
it looks like a car that like everyone's dad drove in the 90s. It's like everyone's businessman dad drove that car.
Yeah,
And-
yeah.
Yeah, and his like little flip phone, his like Nokia phone.
Oh my god! Oh my god! The phone. Yeah, it's
Brosnan's suits look very 90s. His haircut.
they do. It's a very 90s looking movie.
Yeah,
but it's so like deliciously
good.
90s.
Oh, I love it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's great.
it's great. If License to Kill is a absurd 80s action movie, Tomorrow Never Dies is a 90s action movie, just straight up.
100%.
It's great though. Yeah, no, I'm glad we agree on that one. I really don't think there was any other option, but
it really wasn't. You could say The World is not enough, but that one almost feels a little timeless as well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
probably comes down to the fact because setting plays a big part in this too, and the fact that it's set partially in Istanbul kind of makes it feel to me like Istanbul is such a timeless place. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It has existed for centuries, and I think that having the finale take place there and having it randomly have to do with like Russian nuclear submarines makes it feel very divorced from the era that it takes place in.
Yeah, I agree. But moving on to our final decade, because we're not going to do the 2010s because the decade isn't over yet. So maybe the best is yet to come. Who knows?
Well, that's the thing, yeah. It'll come out in the 2020s technically, but
yeah,
February of the 2020s, so let's just we'll count it as the 2010s.
Absolutely. So early 2000s. I am going. This was tough because each of them. Yeah. It really is. This actually may be the toughest decade because each of the films that have come out that came out in the early 2000s distinctly resembles a period in time, like,
or at least
of
a part of that decade. Yeah,
absolutely. Die Another Day is very early 2000s. Casino Royale is very post 9/11, and then Quantum of Solace is incredibly late early 2000s. So it's just kind of like what do you kind of take into account? For me, I personally, I don't know. I think I'm going to go with Quantum of Solace.
Hey, wow, that's the last one I would have picked.
Really? I see.
Yeah,
I understand that, but at the same time, I feel like the way it tackles the economics at the time, the geopolitics at the time, it does incorporate that post 9/11 stuff in there. It's definitely drawing more so than I would say Casino Royale, from like a Bourne aesthetic, which. Casino Royale is by far the best Bond film that's ever been made, and I think that it really modernizes the character. But I don't really know where I was going with that. That was just kind of me stating my opinion. But
every now and then, Griffin just feels the need to talk about how much he loves Casino Royale.
No, but what I was saying was, as much as incredible as that movie is. The early 2000s, Jason Bourne really revolutionized how we interpret action films.
It's one of the most definitive action films of the decade.
Yeah. Of the decade, and that's why I was saying, while I think Casino Royale is an incredible film, and I enjoy it more than the Bourne films, the Bourne films had a lasting impact on action films going forward, and I think you can see that in Quantum of Solace. Sometimes to a detriment, because sometimes I think it's doing it more like a cheap imitation at times. But that's a discussion for a later time. But I think when you incorporate that with all of these vibes that are going into it, I mean, you have Alicia Keys and Jack White, who are very prominent artists during the early 2000s, do the title song to it. Now, I
don't think the song sounds like either one of them is the thing. Well, it doesn't sound like an Alicia Keys song, and it doesn't sound like a Jack White song. It just sounds like
a weird high. It sounds like something else. I'll tell you that much. But right, but like using that kind of like star power to bring it, like I don't know. To me, that film does scream very early 2000s, but at the same time, Die Another Day does as well. That would have been my second option. Would be Die Another Day, and I'm not saying Casino Royale doesn't.
Wrong.
No, I think Casino Royale has a timeless feel to it. It definitely has the rawness and the intensity of a post 9/11 world, but at the same time, like I feel like that film could come out today.
But no, I see. I think aesthetically it very much belongs in that time. And here's what you finish your point about Die Another Day, and I'll.
I'm just gonna say Die Another Day would be my second choice, simply because it really captures the pop culture side of the early 2000s, really playing into, Madonna's doing the title song, where she was having like her second resurgence. I don't know if you call it a second resurgence. It basically started in the 80s. It's just kind of carried through, but it was that early 2000s Madonna sound. The aesthetic of the film was like straight up early 2000s VH1, MTV, that whole thing. The absurdity of it is very like early 2000s silly action movie thing, and I mean that film is dated in 2002, 2002. I mean it is really dated by that. So I agree with you. That's my second pick as well. Die Another Day is my second pick, just because. You're right. It's a completely different time of 2000s than the latter two. It is that very early 2000s, like Britney Spears, MTV. Yeah. Right down to the way the film is like edited with those speed ramps. The beginnings of visual effects. When they're really just starting to test the waters, literally. Yeah, there's this really ugly looking. Yeah. It is a very ugly film. As that early 2000s is a very ugly time in history, and having lived through it, I can say that definitively. Oh yeah. But I mean, at least Bond wasn't walking around in like frosted tips and shit. But could you imagine Pierce with frosted tips? I could. I mean, frosted tips would really fit with the theme of that movie. Oh god, man. But yeah, no. It very much all like a Lee Tamahori, like XXX kind of movie. Yeah. With like that MTV aesthetic, at least MTV of the time. But yeah, no, I think for me, when I think of the 2000s, it is that post 9/11 kind of. When I think of what defined pop culture in the 2000s, it is 9/11. As grim as that is to say, a lot of our media started to reflect that like gritty, cynical kind of like mentality, and especially once you get to Casino Royale, and we're in the Iraq War now, and it's just like this never-ending onslaught of news and all that. And while the film doesn't exactly deal with that stuff directly, it is just sort of very present in the attitudes that the film represents, and then also in the way that it's shot. I think it looks like a post 9/11 thriller in the way that it is shot. I think the color palette, like all of that stuff, like the stuff at the Miami airport, while also being very 9/11 in sort of like in theme and subject matter, just looks like a film that would be based around that idea. What Daniel Craig's wearing with like the jacket and the pants with the blue shirt, looks like the style of the time. Whereas something like, there is a timeless element to it when you go to places like Montenegro, and when you go to Venice and whatever else. I'll give you the color palette thing, because I think you're right. The color palette definitely does. That it does have that like mid early 2000s kind of look. I think even like late 2000s. Yeah, and you also even have like the phones that they're using and all that sort of stuff that really adds to it. The Bond's driving that Ford car. It all just feels very 2000s to me. Bond wears more dress, like more like casual clothes. He wears casual clothes in Madagascar. He wears casual clothes in the he wears like the jacket and the shirt with the opening scene, the fight, and the guy he's fighting wearing that that floral print shirt or whatever he's wearing. It's like the clothing for me. Whereas Quantum of Solace, right? I think you're right. The editing is peak 2000s, and that really pushes it in that direction for me. But it's really the only thing that pushes it in that direction for me. Really? See, but you don't even think like the thematic, like the geopolitics that it's dealing with, the theme but in terms of this aesthetic, no, absolutely the themes of it, definitely. I think Casino Royale deals with it a little bit more. I think this one. Oh, see, I disagree with that. I think the geopolitics are more present in Quantum of Solace, but I think there's more of an undercurrent of 9/11 in Casino Royale. But no, it's definitely present in Quantum of Solace, 100%. You've even got the financial crisis, and you've got this ecological,
like thing going on, which I think even more leans towards 2010s. But,
well, I don't know. I mean, they touch on the whole like you know the world trying to like stockpile oil and stuff like that, which was
right.
I think, you could tie that into the Iraq War and whatnot.
100%. I think, but for me, like with in terms of aesthetic, Quantum of Solace, even though it's still very much a 2000s movie, I think aesthetically it looks more traditional, other than the shaky cam and the quick editing, which is obviously very modern. Yeah, something about like just the way Bond dresses, the way everyone else dresses, the look of the film, the color grading, all that stuff looks more traditional to me than like even like the set design of everything looks more traditional. Like you've got like the opera, which looks like a classic Bond kind of look. Stuff like that. The hotel looks like a classic Bond base kind of thing. Whereas Casino Royale is just in our real world, 100%. You know what I mean?
Yeah, fair enough.
And I think for me that it pushes it over the edge. It gives it the edge on Quantum of Solace. Though I can't argue. It's pretty close. It's a close third in terms of which film feels 2000s to me.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, all three of them do like accurately depict like the years in which they came out.
Yeah, and I think also Casino Royale's title song, like Chris Cornell, just feels. That, when I think of music
Chris Cornell
in the 2000s,
it plays into the early 2000s rock, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that alt rock kind of sound to it, like that kind of sound that he has. I mean, yeah. I mean, Madonna also plays into that. She's more of like her song is more of like a pop song from the early 2000s. But where Quantum of Solace doesn't sound like anything to me.
I mean, it just sounds bad. It's just taking two prominent artists from that decade.
Yeah, but even if it was a good song, I don't think it sounds like particularly like a pop song from that era anyway. Like you compare it to like what like Lady Gaga was doing at the time, what Katy Perry was doing at the time. It doesn't sound like anything like that.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
But
man, I don't know. It's interesting because, like you said, for all of these, there's so many to choose from. With
and you really could go the other way. Like
I completely agree. But before we close this out, and I know we've been going a long time, so thank you for sticking with us, and hopefully you enjoy all of the content that we've been, kind of giving you here. Before we close this out, if you just had to choose one from the 2010s, obviously the 2010s aren't over, but I think, as we approach the end of them, we can kind of get a feel for which one best represents it. We've only gotten two in this decade, so out of the two, which would you choose? You don't have to give like an explanation or anything, but if you had to choose one, which would you choose?
Aesthetically, not in terms of subject matter.
Everything. You got to take everything into account.
I know you can, but I think I'm going to go aesthetically because it's just too hard for me to pick otherwise. Aesthetically, it's Skyfall for me.
Okay, interesting. Because I say Spectre.
Yeah, well, I knew you were going to say that, and I think Spectre again has more of like a classic throwback look to it. I think just the set design, the way Bond's dressed feels more like it's. I mean, because 60s is back in right now anyway, in terms of like aesthetic, but I think it's more deliberately trying to pay homage to like those earlier films in Spectre, whereas Skyfall, I mean, and this is not a new observation, has like this look and feel of like, a blockbuster from the 2010s. Like
I'll agree with you that. It feels very much yeah.
Well, cinematography, it's on a whole nother playing field because of Roger Deakins, but just in terms of like the set design, the way the film is shot, that kind of thing, kind of like a Dark Knight vibe to it, which the Dark Knight, I would say, is the film that the Dark Knight Rises are the two films that really defined the 2010s action movie aesthetic.
Even if the Dark Knight came out in 2008.
Well, that's at the end of the 2010.
I'd say Inception. Inception defined the 2010s.
Inception too, but Inception, Dark Knight, very similar in terms of like
there's a slight difference.
Visual palette. I mean, there's a slight difference, but
that's neither here or there. But I get what you're saying about it.
I think the Dark Knight definitely going forward defined what action movies for the next decade were going to look like.
Sure.
And because it came out in the in the 2000s, but its imitators started coming out in the 2010s.
Yeah,
and
we'll say that. Yeah.
And well, not that Skyfall is an imitator, but it is very much in that vein, in that same that same class, because everything was. All the Mission Impossible films post Dark Knight have been Dark Knight tinged. Everything has been. It's just and so Spectre feels like it's paying homage to some of the earlier films aesthetically, but Skyfall 100% looks like that. I mean, it's hard to say because we haven't finished the decade yet, and who knows, Bond 25 could easily blow these two out of the water in terms of aesthetic, but that's what I'm going to go with.
No, fair enough. And like I said, I would go with Spectre. I'm not going to really go into detail about it. We got on long enough, but there you have it. So there you have it, guys. That's going to do it for this episode of The Words Are Not Enough. Episode number 20. Got an extra special long episode for you for our 20th. Extra spectral.
I tried to work spectre in there.
Boy, man, the puns. So yeah, thank you as always for listening. And let us, as always, make sure to let us know your thoughts and opinions on the topics discussed down in the comment section below of wherever you are listening to this podcast. Mr. Brody Saravelli, thank you for joining me as always. And where can everyone find you?
You can find me at Brody Saravelli if you want to find my regular Twitter. And if you want to hear my thoughts on Bond stuff, or you want to follow the show, you should give at Twain Pod, at TWANE Pod, a follow. That's where all of these. That's where this discussion topic came from. That's where all the other discussion topics we've talked about have come from. That's where we engage with you guys. That's where the giveaway came from. So give us a follow there if you want to keep your thumb on the pulse of the show, and also you just want to talk about Bond, because I am always down to shoot the breeze about Bond. So
absolutely, yeah. Go give that Twitter account a follow. He's doing great stuff over there on the account. But also take a second here, if you haven't already, and give this podcast a rating and a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're listening to this, your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps get the show noticed. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be maybe reading some reviews if you leave them, giving you guys some thanks and recognition. So if that's interesting, if that interests you at all, definitely consider doing that, but also just show some appreciation for the show, and it helps us out greatly, lets us know on what to improve and what not. But as always, guys, you can follow the Twain account. You can also like Men vs. Movies, the channel that we run that puts on this show. You can like Men vs. Movies on Facebook, follow us on Twitter simply by searching Men vs. Movies. Go give the channel a subscribe if you're interested in other film related content, and if you like me specifically and you like what I have to say, you can give me a follow on Twitter at Griff Schiller. All right, that's going to do it for episode number 20 of The Words Are Not Enough. And until next time, take care.